pixel art is incredible. One of the pillars of game development from the very beginning of game design, even to this day, pixel art has been perhaps the most important art form in the medium thus far. Now, sure, nowadays most AAA game companies are so obsessed with cramming enough photorealism in their games that you can smell Nathan Drake's aftershave, but the charm, vibrance and care that pixel art showcases in iconic titles such as Shovel Knight and Terraria is something that even the most beefy of PCs can't really replicate with sheer technological power. It's been my passion for many years now, and ever since I started, I've had a great deal of interest and respect for the many different uses of pixel art across the gaming industry. And there's one indie game in particular that has inspired me a bit more than the rest. That being The Binding of Isaac Rebirth. Afterbirth. Repentance. Okay, Edmund, how many of these DLCs do you need to make? And that's why today I would like to provide a bit of analysis into the pixel art of this game to see why, even nearly a decade later, it's still such an iconic example of the medium I love. Except the intruder, this makes me want to vom my soul out. Now, it's fair to say that this game is rather expansive, with 9 years of DLCs, updates, booster packs, the whole Tesco shop, so there are naturally a lot of sprites to cover here, so I think it's best to start with what you'll be seeing the most throughout the game, the character designs. There are a total of 34 characters in this game, and the majority of them are based around this central Isaac sprite. Now, the first thing you may notice about it is that these black outlines are 2 pixels wide in fact, which is a design choice that the majority of the sprites in this game follow. These are meant to emulate the fully black and bold outlines that were a part of the original Flash Isaac's art style, which also had these but hand drawn. These outlines do a great job of allowing the player to keep track of where they are, because it can get pretty hard to focus on everything when some of these bosses chuck a small country's worth of bullets at you. And this same benefit carries over to the enemies, who also have these outlines, making the game an easy to read experience for players. However, to ensure that the character sprites don't feel like they're melting, the colours in these outlines need to stick out, which brings us to the choice of palette for the game, and for the characters specifically, they use a pretty standard and small selection of colours. Specifically, only 6 colours are used to make up the default Isaac sprite, 3 for the skin, 2 for the tears, and only 1 highlight being a basic white colour for the eyes. This basic colour scheme makes these sprites very readable and almost like a blank slate for the player, which is very useful due to the obscene amount of cosmetic changes that come with the items you collect throughout the game, which, trust me, we'll get to and have night terrors about. The lack of highlights on the skin means that to portray any form of lighting or detail, the shading has to do a lot of work, which I'm glad to say it does. With the light source seemingly coming from directly in front or on top of the character, depending on the perspective, the shading is done around the head and uses a technique called anti-aliasing, which you can see here. This is a shading technique that is used to make the shadows of an object blend into the rest of the sprite more smoothly, making sharp edges not seem as sharp, which can be a common problem in pixel art. To do this, the artist uses a sort of in-between colour of the shaded skin and the outline that has a perceived value that falls roughly in the middle of the darker skin and the black outline. Oh yeah, I should probably explain what a perceived value is, A perceived value, or luminance if you prefer, is basically how bright or dark our brains perceive a certain colour to be, and sharp changes in this value can cause our brains to see a sprite as very blocky and stuck on a grid, if you will, instead of a coherent piece. Anti-aliasing helps combat this by using these in-between colours to bridge the gap in a smoother way, while still keeping the main colours of the sprite intact if not overdone, resulting in a much smoother sprite overall. This technique is one of the main barriers that I had when I first started pixel art, and true mastery of it can heavily improve a piece as a whole. To illustrate this, let's use our buddy Isaac here as an example by taking away all of his shading, leaving only the basic colours. Looks pretty iffy, right? He looks like you're about to air fry him after taking him out of the freezer. But how about we just add back 1 colour to shade him? Now this looks a bit better. There's some clear depth here and it doesn't look completely flat anymore, but it still feels quite jagged, especially these segments here on the side of his head where the sharpest curves are. Now, here is where we introduce our in-between colour that bridges the gap between the extremely dark outline and the brighter colour we use to shade it, which makes the transition from skin to outline much more seamless. And there you go. Now the sprite looks much more smooth and not as attached to a grid as it was, making it much more pleasant to look at. Okay, now that we've gone over the base character sprites, let's look at how the devs varied it throughout the rest of the game, the most common change being the hairstyle that each character has. Out of the 17 non-tainted characters in the game, over half of them are a simple hairstyle swap, which both ties into the lore of these characters being a simple costume swap in Isaac's head, and is a very concise way of differentiating each character. Adding to this, we finally see some more varied colours in these character sprites, from the red fez of Judas, which we'll get to the importance of colours like red later, to the unique orange or ginger colour of Lazarus, making each character stick out from the rest of the game, as many of these colours are very rare outside of their specific characters, mainly Maggie's yellow hair and Lazarus's aforementioned orange. And Eden just says fuck it! All of their hair! The rest of the base cast do a lot more to differentiate themselves, mainly by having a completely different skin colour, such as Azazel being a dark black similar to the demons of the game, Blue Baby being, well, blue, which signifies how Isaac canonically suffocates in the chest. Yeah, I forget how dark this game is until I say it out loud, huh? And Apollyon being grey, using a similar palette to the stone enemies within the game, placing these characters within their own specific archetypes similar to the enemies. Then we have the Forgotten, the Keeper, and the Lost, who have entirely unique sprites which match how differently they play to the rest of the base cast, from being melee focused, to being entirely based around money, to giving old Isaac players flashbacks, which all allow the player to understand their unique gameplay styles from the sprites alone. The tainted characters take this concept even further, and do a lot more to appear even more extreme, which is expected of the whole Ruin theme that they're going for, with the more simple examples like Tainted Isaac adding some basic blood streams and bruising, which incorporates another rare colour being purple, to the more obvious changes like Tainted Esau becoming a complete hell demon, which accurately expresses how powerful he is and how terrified you should be of this thing. On the opposite end, we have characters like Tainted Lost or Azazel, who use less saturated grades in the Lost case, and a less organised hairstyle and more blood in Azazel's case, both of which portraying the weakened and battered state that many of these tainted characters are in. Both ends of this spectrum that are shown in these sprites portray the chaotic and unique gameplay of many of these tainted characters, especially compared to the relatively basic gameplay of their base forms. So, overall, the character sprites within this game do a very good job of both contributing to the stories and lore of these characters, such as Blue Baby and the Tainteds, but they also give the player a solid view into the gameplay that they should expect out of these characters, from the plain experiences of Isaac to the utter chaos of the likes of half the Tainted cast, and also the utter hopelessness of these useless pricks. And with that, I think we've covered everything major to do with the characters that you play as. So now it's time to cover what I believe to be the most distinctive part of the pixel art within this game, the enemy design. The large variety of different themes within the floors of this game, from a simple basement to sewers to pretty much hell, means that the enemies also have to cover a huge variety of designs, colours, anatomy and so on, much more than the characters at least. This means that there's no feasible way for me to cover every single one here, so instead, let's cover them in some key groups, first of which we'll call normal monsters. This section covers most of the regular enemies that don't have any major supernatural or non-biological design choices, and, more often than not, inhabit the earlier floors of the game. The earliest of these enemies that inhabit the basement normally have very minimal details or animations, such as the gapers that are nearly exactly like the base Isaac sprite except their eyes have been slurped out, to the large number of flies that mainly just change colour or are slightly bigger or differently shaped. These enemies do get some interesting variations depending on which version of each floor you get on any given run, such as some basement enemies having a fiery change if you get the burning basement, which usually just ignites them, but some enemies, such as Clotty, get a complete reskin that matches the more hectic theming of the burning basement, which can be seen in the complete fear in their eyes. The bosses within this normal category usually follow these same principles of basic colour schemes and detail, and a less threatening aura most of the time, with bosses like Little Horn and Plum being sprited with very happy facial expressions within their animations. They're just happy to be here, you know? Only on rare occasions do these normal creatures present any visual threat in their sprites, with these bosses having mostly smiling and goofy animations. For example, the Horn is seemingly scared of you, as its animations give the impression that it's trying to hide from you, and these two just don't really know what the hell is happening. The vast majority of these bosses are still anchored in a very anatomical design, and what I mean by this is that, with the exception of the Haunter and Steven, they're all basic animals or object-based monsters like flies, worms, poop, or just raw lumps of flesh. This basic nature of the early chapter bosses, within their sprites and animations, even down to their intro screens, causes new players to not really fear these bosses as much as what we're about to see later on, which is a very good vibe to give these first bosses, as it eases players in very well. As you progress down into the floors of the mid-game, these normal bosses begin to push the boundaries of how detailed and expansive their designs can get, while still being grounded by a biological base. The worm bosses, as an example, go from some basic segments of skin to massive hulking beasts in chub, to even adding some skeletal aspects with the Carrion Queen, progressively introducing the player to more threatening animations and monsters through these sprites and designs. The Stain, Gurdy, Peep, all still based around anatomical designs, but with a greater amount of exaggeration than the first floor bosses, steadily increasing the perceived threat and overall excitement that the player feels when fighting these bosses. The lower amount of playful animations these bosses now have give off the feeling that the game is slowly loosening the hold it has on your hand and leading you into some real danger, overall portraying the difficulty and design progression that happens later in the game. The womb floor bosses is where these normal creatures peak in terms of complexity, mainly because it's the final floor that isn't focused on the other two categories that we'll get to in a moment, and these designs go all in on the gore, horror and threat that has been slowly building up as we have explored the basement. The Gurdy line of bosses have become so big that they can't even fit a fat ass on the screen anymore. The bosses are literally fusing into a massive ball of worms and flesh with the matriarch, and the bloat exists. Speaking of flesh, you may have noticed that as these bosses have progressed, the colour of the reds that have been used for these bosses have become less and less saturated, as we can see here between Fruity Plum, which has a very saturated and exaggerated shade of red, to Gurdy and Mr. Fred having far more realistic and veiny details and shades, making their designs more grotesque and visceral, overall contributing to increasing the shock value of these normal creatures as the game progresses, tying the increasingly difficult gameplay and increasing stakes in terms of the story all into the sprite work of these bosses. Now that we've gone over these normal creatures, it's time to progress past the womb and to analyse the duality of the angelic and the demonic bosses of the game. Now, it's blatantly obvious that there's a lot of religious themes running through the last few floors of the game, and the sprite work of either side of these enemies are a key portrayal of these themes, so let's start with the holy spirits, such as these angels. First off, you may notice that these things have no mouth and must scream, and this lack of face is meant to portray the supposed purity of these angelic enemies, which is seen further by the blues and yellows within the robes that it wears and the angelic lasers it fires during the fight, both of which contribute to the holy aura, as these two colours are often associated with light and purity. This can even be seen in their wings being a bright white, a staple of angelic designs and also quite a rare colour within this game, usually being saved for the ghostly enemies of the game, making the sheer scale and shock of seeing these bosses stick out even more. Even the animation of these angel wings is far more smooth and utilises more frames than the majority of the demonic enemies in the game, such as Krampus, whose wings have very minimal frames to portray his flight, distinguishing the two sides even more. For one last point that adds to the purity aspect of these sprites, notice how many of the enemies that appear on the cathedral have very little blemishes, such as no veins in these holy eye enemies unlike most other eyes in the game, for example. This lack of detail in their anatomy makes them appear more supernatural than any other enemy in the game, without overly exaggerating their design, giving them an entirely unique threat as these pure but still powerful creatures, which is perfect considering you're staring down the soldiers of God himself. The final boss of the cathedral perfectly portrays this too, as it's just Isaac in all of its plainness, perfectly closing out this theme of purity, as Isaac is the blank slate of the game as we discussed earlier, and the addition of his wings brings this nothing of a character sprite into a new holy and powerful light, cleanly epitomising the theme that the holy enemies aim to portray on the cathedral floor. On the opposite end of this scale, we have the demonic enemies of the Sheol, and immediately we can see that many of the artistic choices run completely contrary to that of the angels. The colours consist of harsh reds and blacks, with many gruesome details such as the prominent teeth protruding out of many of these imps and devils, as well as horns erupting from their heads to make these sprites seem larger and more menacing as a result, replacing the awe and caution that players would feel with the angelic enemies with terror and panic, heavily contrasting the gameplay feel of either side through these sprites. The animations of some of these enemies further induce this form of fear, such as the imps and the Begotten having very erratic movements with minimal frames, almost like they're shaking in anticipation for killing you, like they're taking pleasure in attacking the player, constantly reminding the player that they chose the far more hostile path and now have to endure and fight it, while the angels try to lure the player into a false sense of security by appearing pure and non-threatening. The demons have nothing to hide and outwardly show their threat through their colour schemes, animations and more gruesome details, which fits the demons perfectly.
This all comes to a head with the final boss of the floor, being of course, Satan himself. Please don't nuke my channel already, YouTube, it's the game, not me. His muscular design, piercing red eyes, and the sheer scale of his sprite thanks to his massive wingspan. The fear that has been building up across the floor finally culminates into this fight, and his animations have this power behind them, like he's throwing everything at you with sheer anger and spite, highlighting the brutality that the demons in this game hold and portraying their pixels. This is further seen during his second phase, where he morphs into a massive goat foot and tries to crush you. The minimal frames used in this stomping animation giving the player a sense of speed and power as he attempts to flatten you outright. There's no nuance to his animations, no neat tricks, but complete and utter rage, perfect for the ruler of hell himself. Whoa, that got intense there for a minute, didn't it? I guess talking about the servants of the damn underworld does that to a person, huh? Well, now that we've discussed all of the main categories of enemy that I wanted to talk about, let's get to the chaos that the hundreds of items within this game have in their artwork, from the items themselves to the twisted things they do to Isaac. 717 items, huh? As if this video hasn't already taken enough years off my life. Well, in any case, the items in this game are so ridiculously varied in both function and visuals that, just like the enemies, providing a comprehensive insight into every single one is an utterly ridiculous feat. So I would like to, instead, cover some of the key design themes that run through the entire cast of items and their cosmetic changes, and how they affect the gameplay experience. To begin with, as we have covered the holy and unholy enemies, I think it's best to cover the Angel and Devil deal items first. For the delightfully devilish side of the item pool, a lot of the same themes that we saw with the demonic enemies can also be found within these items, consisting of harsh red in cases such as Abaddon or the iconic Brimstone, the dark shades of the many books that can be found here. Never knew Satan was such an avid reader. Adding to this, a theme of death within a lot of these items such as dead cats, the majority of the familiars you can find here, and so on is very noticeable, with the classic crossed out eyes featuring on many of these items to denote said death. These eyes aren't the only way that these items portray passing away, however. For example, the greens used in Ross and Baby Sprite and the unique posing of dead cat provide many different ways of showing the player that this item pool for Devil deals is an absolute bloodbath, fitting for its focus on quick boost to a player's power. Items such as Damocles, Death's Touch, and Mother's Knife, all being blades, give off the sense that the strength of these items must be worth the health that you pay for them, as there's no ambiguity as to what you get. When you look at items like a mushroom or a freaking purple fly, despite how good these items actually are in-game, they don't really give off that aura from their sprites. However, with these Devil Deal items, you can immediately tell from just looking at them that they're gonna cause your enemies a lot of hurt, because obviously things like scythes and knives are gonna kick ass, like, come on. This same theme also applies to the Angel Room items, as items such as Sacred Heart and Godhead are immediately striking to the player due to the flames of Sacred Heart and, well, the weirdness of Godhead, showing that the sprites can do a great job of portraying the power and gameplay experience of each side of these deals, with Devil Deals showing the item's sheer power, and the Angels portraying more measured and often defensive strength through sprites like the Wafer, appearing more pure due to their limited colour scheme and basic shape. Also with these Angel Room items, a lot of these sprites are very extravagant in terms of their lighting, with lower opacity pixels being used to give them a glowing effect such as Holy Light and Crown of Light, showing their power by seeming more ethereal and grand instead of violent like the Devil Deal items. This does make sense, as Angel Rooms are by far the more safe option between the two deals, while being slightly harder to come by as you need to actively reject Devil Deals in order to get them, so the more powerful Angel Room items need to seem more exciting and awe-inducing to portray the reward that the player has been given before resisting the temptation of the Devils. So overall, much like the enemies, the Angel and Devil Deal items do a solid job of portraying their power in different ways using their artwork, strongly representing the brutality and the grand power of the Devils and Angels respectively. Okay, now that we've covered those two categories, how many items do we have left? 580? Well then, guess there's no good way of splitting these up anymore, so let's just dive into the rest of these things now. The first theme that runs through a lot of these items in the game is that the sprites that appear more striking or out of place to the player often have the strongest effects, and will, as a result, cause the biggest reaction from players whether they know how good an item is or not. For example, no one is going to look at a freaking bean and think that they've just won their run. It doesn't stand out in the slightest visually, which is fitting considering pretty much all of them are utter trash tier items. However, when they see a massive green goddamn spider, they're probably going to be a lot more interested and react more strongly, both due to its weird colouring and how the sprite is much bigger than the majority of the others in the game due to the legs expanding so far out. And the player is right to react more because Mutant Spider is a very strong item in most circumstances. Interactions like this can be found all over the sprite work of this game, as generally more underwhelming items have very basic or unnoteworthy sprites, while the more iconic or powerful items stick out far more. Now, this isn't a universal rule, sometimes this expectation can be subverted to keep players on their toes and curious about every item in the game, encouraging them to always experiment with different items as they become more experienced, such as Rock Bottom or Ipecac not looking particularly exciting, but actually being some of the strongest items in the game in their right hands, showing how, while the pixel art of these items is often indicative of how desirable the item is, this rule can be played with to give a more fulfilling and interesting gameplay experience. A similar version of this rule can also be applied to the cosmetic changes that many of these items put Isaac through, as a lot of the more notable and strong items change his sprite in more drastic, shocking or downright disgusting ways, from Epic Fetus turning you into a dashing young man, to C-section, nope, not touching that. The opposite is also true, with items like Charm of the Vampire providing a small but noticeable change, which fit the small boosts in damage and survivability that the item provides, constantly tying the sprite work into the gameplay experience seamlessly. But then there are times when the devs want to remind us that we're playing a very dark and honestly messed up game, and that's where the extreme sprites like Intruder, Too Spooky and Roar of the Void come in. These items are all at varying levels of viability, but they all carry a very extreme reaction to players when we see what they do to Isaac. Players in general in this game tend to forget how messed up it actually is in concept due to how fun the gameplay is, causing us to get very numb to the gory or scarier aspects of the art direction. However, items like this are always a nice reminder of the shock factor that this game can provide at times, creating a refreshing thrill for many players, new and old. These are some of my favourite sprites in the game personally, because the sheer level of detail and the craziness that I put into them is something to behold, honestly, even to someone like me who has played hundreds of hours in this game at this point and has played since the original Rebirth. Sprites like this remind me of why I was drawn to this game in the first place. The unique and unapologetic story, art style and concepts are so rare nowadays as many creators don't really enjoy covering topics like this, but this game casually throws a living spider in a child's face and tells us to deal with it while giving us one of the most fun and well built roguelikes ever made, and I for one appreciate the legacy it has left for not only the indie gaming scene at large, but also for me personally, as it has inspired my art so much. And that's about everything that I wanted to cover in this video. I know that I've only really scratched the surface of the sprite work within this game, as the sheer amount of artistic skill and interesting design choices could have taken me hours to cover, so I think I'm satisfied with my insights today, and I hope you are too. This is my first try at anything close to this scale in terms of pixel art analysis, so I would appreciate your feedback in the comments below for what you'd want to see. And while you're there, of course, make sure to like, subscribe, all of the standard stuff, you know. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you when I see ya. Bye!